All right, we're ready for James chapter 5. We'll wind up the book of James today and start into 1 Peter, and that will wind this trimester up. Next trimester, we go into 2 Peter, and so we'll just continue on with that, and then we'll continue on all the way through the book of Jude, and then we'll get 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John, and then Jude, and then we'll save Revelation for later, and we're going to go to the minor prophets for a little bit. There'll be 4 minor prophets we'll look at in the next trimester. But anyway, be that as it may, we're ready for James chapter 5 to wind this up. We've dealt with the fact that the book of James deals with an active faith. In every chapter it touches on an active faith, and that is including chapter 5. And we'll see some things about an active faith in chapter 5. To review where we've been, chapter 1 dealt with trials and temptations. Now that's important for us to remember, and let's just establish this here, and we don't have to do that later. In chapter 1, beginning at verse 2, he talks about, actually verse 1, trials and temptations are for our good, and that God will help us in the midst of that. But I want you to see that they are oppressed, because that plays into some things we're going to see in chapter 5, verses 1 to 6. So this reminds you that in chapter 1, he talks about them being oppressed, that there are trials, there are temptations, like later in the chapter 1, solicitation to sin. But I'm more interested at this juncture of the pressure that's put on them and the oppression that is brought on by outside forces. And we'll see more about that in chapter 2. So chapter 1 was trials and temptations. Chapter 2 dealt with faith and works. And in the midst of that, he talked in verse 7 and 8 that they blasphemed that worthy name by which you are called. Someone was oppressing them and blaspheming the name Christian, or the name by which they were called. That's important to remember too in just a little bit. But we saw faith and works in chapter 2. Chapter 3 dealt with teachers controlling the tongue and the use of wisdom, 2 major thoughts in that chapter. Then last week we called that self-seeking pride. And that's root of all worldliness. It's cured by humility. It's manifested in a number of ways. So what's chapter 5 about? It's not one of your questions. Go ahead. Trusting in your money. Okay. Not to trust in riches and wealth and money. What else? All right, he talks about prayer and the power of prayer. He gives Elijah as an example of that. Anything else? Is there a common theme to some of the subjects? Several subjects are dealt with in chapter 5. Is there a banner under which we could group those? Okay. That's exactly right. We all suffer. What'd you say? Patience. Patience is dealt with, verses 7 through 11. Absolutely. That's the first point on which he starts. Very good point. I call chapter 5 encouragement in the midst of oppression. That's why I took the time a moment ago to remind it. Chapter 1, chapter 2 sets the pace that they are being oppressed. By whom? I don't know. This is a general epistle. It would seem that it's talking about Judaizing teachers to some degree, and that may play into some things later in chapter 5. We'll get to that in a moment. But there's some encouragement to be given in the midst of oppression. So everything in the chapter relates to that concept somehow. It's not just miscellaneous thoughts that are thrown out and just scattered in different directions. They seem to have that common banner. So here's what I see in the chapter. The oppressors are going to be condemned, verses 1 to 6. In the midst of oppression, what you need to do is be patient, endure, don't give up, don't swear in the midst of this oppression. Don't make rash oaths in the midst of oppression. Be a person of your word. Pray in the midst of oppression and sickness and affliction, and then keep one another in the truth. When you are being oppressed, it's important that each one of us help the other stay within the truth, living in the truth and not wander from the truth and commit sin. So you see how all of that relates to each other. Here is encouragement in the midst of this oppression to not give up but keep on keeping on. Make sense? All right, let's go to questions for today. Question number 1, is James condemning the brethren to whom he writes in verses 1 and 2? All right, he's condemning someone rich. You're shaking your head no, Annie Lou.
I don't think he is, because after the first two verses, or verse 7, it says, brethren, be patient, because God will take care of it.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I want to say more about that in a moment, but I do not think he is addressing in verses 1 to 6 the brethren, condemning them, and then turning around telling them to endure. But he's condemning their oppressor, and we'll give evidence of that here in just a moment. So let's go to question 2. If that answer be correct, then what does James say to those who oppress God's people? What did he say in verses 1 to 6? They're going to be judged. They're going to be judged by their actions. Anything else? Say again. Misery is coming upon them. Verse 1. All right, let's start verses 1 to 6. I think he's talking about their oppressor is going to be condemned. And so we start with the question, who's being addressed here? I'm convinced it's not the brethren that are addressed at verse 7, because he seems to shift gears, as Annie Lou pointed out just a moment ago. He's not dealing with brethren, but their enemies, their oppressor. That's why I mentioned again, chapter 1, chapter 2 talks about their being oppressed. And I think he's addressing those oppressors. Now you say, that's a little odd that right in the middle of a letter to brethren that he addresses the oppressed. That was common in the prophets, wasn't it? Quite often the prophet would be addressing Judah or Israel, but he turns and talks about Egypt. Or he may talk about the Babylonians, or he may talk about the Assyrians as if he's addressing them. Does that make sense? He did that quite often. Well, we have the same kind of thing here. They're not addressed in verses 1 through 6 as brethren, but they are starting at verse 7. And furthermore, there's no call for repentance here. In other words, there is not a statement, and usually in a context where someone is being condemned, there is a call for a change. There's not a call for a change, it's just a condemnation of them. It's not that God doesn't want them to change, but it seems to be that he's addressing his oppressor. So let's see, that's my understanding of that, and you may disagree, and that's fine. He starts with this expression, come now. That is a rebuke. That's a form of rebuke. If you see that expression, come now, and find it in any other text, it's always followed by some form of rebuke. Come now, you rich, weep and howl for your miseries. Well, let's start with this question. Is James condemning them because they are rich? Why you say no?
Well, I mean, the way they depended on their riches, they forgot about God is where it seems.
All right. How do I know? You're correct. How do I know that he's not condemning riches? Let's go back to our principles we're learning on Wednesday night. When we're interpreting a text, we've got to do something. Absolutely. We've got to harmonize this text with other texts. And so there were very wealthy people. Abraham, Job were righteous people, just as a sampling of two, that were very righteous, even though they were rich. So God's not condemning wealth. He's not condemning riches. So those who have wealth or riches are extremely wealthy. They're not condemned because of that. But he's talking about the oppressors generally were rich in this context. Yes, ma'am. Absolutely. They've held back some of the wages that was due to their workers. Three things we see here, and that is the misery is going to come upon them. We see the riches are useless, and then the reason for their judgment is because they've oppressed the poor, including these Christians to whom he's writing. So he said, weep and howl, for your miseries are coming upon you. In other words, judgment is coming upon the oppressor. Your riches are corrupted. He seems to use some figurative language here. Not that they're riches themselves, so they have money and they turn to their money to get ready to spend it, and it's all corrupted and corroded. That's not the point. But what he's saying is arguing in verses 2 and 3, your riches are useless, as if something has corroded, or as if it's rusted, or if it's deteriorated somehow. Your riches are corrupted, your garments are moth-eaten. In other words, riches can be corruptible. They become useless. Your gold and silver are corroded. The gold and silver is not literally corroded, and their corrosion is a witness against you and will eat your flesh like fire. One commentator suggested they are so embracing their gold and silver that as the gold and silver is being corrupted, it's corrupting them. Does that make sense? So the more I embrace my riches, the more I embrace materialism, the more corrupting impact it has upon me. I'm being affected by that. And I think that's the idea of verse 4. And you've heaped up treasure in the last days. What does that mean?
I know what Jesus said about laying up treasures on this earth and piling them up with all your faith in that.
Right. So they've heaped up treasures, but these treasures they're going to reap from, not in a good way, but they're going to reap from them in a bad way. In other words, they're going to reap that corruption. That you've been hoarding up corruption, and that's going to, it's not going to help. So the point here, I think, is the wealth isn't going to help you in the day of judgment, and your wealth's going to all be taken away, ultimately. So your wealth, riches are useless. I'm more interested in the reason for this. We've touched on this already. Verse 4, what have they done?
The rich he's referring to as dealt wrongly with the people that are the working class, the ones that work for the rich. They're holding back from them and paying up only what they have to.
Yes. Holding back their way. In other words, they're defrauding the poor. So they're taking advantage of the poor. They're cheating them, exactly. So you've held back wages. Perhaps some of these Christians that are dealt with in the context have been defrauded by them. And the cries of the reaper have reached the ears of the Lord of Sabaoth. What does that mean, Sabaoth? Not Sabbath, but the Sabaoth.
Something to do with like the Lord of War or battles.
Yeah, the Lord of hosts. It has to do with his might and his power. In other words, the powerful God hears the cry of these oppressors. In other words, God's going to bring vengeance. He is the Lord of hosts. He's the Lord of might. He's the Lord of power. And he's going to bring vengeance. Verse 5, they lived in luxury. You've lived on earth in pleasure and luxury, and you have fattened your hearts as in the day of slaughter. In other words, you've fattened yourself for the slaughter. You're heaping up riches and materialism, but what you've done is fatten yourself for the slaughter like a cow. And then at verse 6, he said, you have condemned and you have murdered the just. You have mistreated the just. I take that. Maybe that's literal murder. It may be that they've despised them, mistreated them. In that sense, they've murdered. Whatever the case, they have abused those who are poor. So verses 1 to 6, I'm convinced, is addressing the oppressor, saying you're going to be condemned because of your mistreatment of those who are the just and those who are God's people. Now, what does that mean to the Christian as he reads that? That was addressed as if it was spoken to the oppressor. The oppressor probably wouldn't even see that because this was written to Christians.
I think it could be a good practical lesson to those that were showing partiality. We read in this chapter when the poor come in, you make them sit in the back. In this context, the rich is showing partiality to the poor and condemning them and pushing them down.
Okay, it would lace with chapter 2. Good point. What else? Say again.
Others as you want to be treated.
Okay. Treat others the way you want to be treated.
I would say it happens today. I mean, we're still, you might be cheated or whatever, but you just gotta not worry about letting the Lord take care of it.
All right, good point. I want you to get the point that probably the oppressor is not going to get this book and read it. And so what benefit is there for the writer to write to Christians as if he's addressing the oppressor, saying you're going to weep, you're going to mourn, you're going to be punished, you're going to face judgment. It's an encouragement to the Christian to know their oppressor is going to be dealt with. Does that make sense?
Warning to the Christian that may become wealthy.
Yeah.
May go out and go into that city and buy and trade and become wealthy. And also
Absolutely.
become wealthy and he needs to have that.
But does this make sense that how that encourages? That's what the prophets were about. The judgment on the nations had to do with. It encouraged God's people. That when God says Babylon is going to fall, that encouraged Israel, encouraged Judah. This sort of encouraged the people of God. Our oppressors, we're so oppressed, we're being mistreated, and we're at times thinking about just throwing up our hands and quitting, and God's going to deal with them. And so let's just be patient because that's the next thought that follows. Make sense? All right. Now let's go to verse 7 through verse 11 and the idea of patience. Be patient. What does the word patient mean, by the way? Long suffering, having to do with endurance. All right. Two things happen in these verses. One, be patient because you know the coming of the Lord is near. Now, what is the coming of the Lord? We'll get to that in a second. But then he gives three examples of encouragement of where patience works and you have to wait for the fruit to come. And he gives three examples of that, of endurance. So we'll come back to the examples in a moment. Therefore, be patient. Some translations may use the word endure or endurance or long suffering. In other words, his point is he's not saying don't be agitated. But what he's saying is endure. Don't give up. Don't throw up your hands and quit. Now, one of the things that ought to help us with that is the fact that before this we've seen the oppressor is going to be dealt with. He's not getting by scot-free. Be patient, brethren, until the coming of the Lord. Now, we'll come back to the rest of verse 7. Verse 8, be patient, establish your hearts. In other words, be firm, hold to your roots, don't let them shake you, for the coming of the Lord is at hand. Now, let's go to question number 3. This is a tough question. And that is this the second coming, or is this the coming and destruction on Jerusalem? What do you think?
I think it's coming of the Lord, personally.
All right. Then the second coming. Anybody else?
I think it's the second coming because it's directed to Christians too. I mean, that's what we have. We don't have the ending of the Jerusalem, but I think that's our encouragement to
To say the least in application, it would apply to the second coming with us. George?
I think we've got God's destruction.
All right. Maybe it's the destruction of Jerusalem. So what's going to help us with this? Let's pull some of our tools from Wednesday night. Maybe our tools won't help. They might help.
This is the general epistle written not only to a specific group,
Right? It's not a specific group.
not being judged.
I'm sorry?
The next verse talks about us
Being
being judged.
judged? I think the common thought is the coming of the Lord has reference to the second coming. That's the first thing we think of, almost in every text. Not all comings of the Lord are in context with or deal with the second coming. Sometimes it can have reference to coming in judgment. We find that in the Old Testament a good bit. The phrase that throws us a little bit is, it is at hand. Some translations will say that it's near. And I don't know of any concept where we know for sure the second coming is near. In other words, we know it's coming, we just don't know when. The text argues that we don't know when. Coming as a thief in the night, we don't know the day nor the hour, Matthew 24, Mark 13, etc. So that's the phrase that throws us a little bit. However, several commentators make the observation that the at hand does not always mean near as much as it can, or it can also mean simply it's possible any day. It could be near. And so that it may be arguing, and tell you the truth, I've been back and forth on that. I have taught it at times thinking I think it's the second coming. And other times I've thought, no, I believe it's the destruction of Jerusalem. If our date of the book be correct, which is about 65, no later than 65 AD, then the destruction of Jerusalem is coming soon, by 70 AD. So that is near. That was close at hand. That was nearby. But was the second coming near? Well, it's near in the sense that it's possible at any day. And so to tell you the truth, I'm not sure what it is. But I want to lean toward more the second coming of the Lord, that it's saying it's possible at any day, because in light of the context, verses 1 to 6 talks about the oppressor is going to be condemned. Now, you could well argue that if it is Jewish, then the nation's going to be destroyed. The Jewish oppressor is going to be destroyed in AD 70. The nation be destroyed, basically. So maybe that's what he's talking about. But I want to think that he's talking about destruction in the end of time, verses 1 to 6. And if that be the case, then this judgment that he's talking about, the judge is standing at the door ready to execute judgment. But again, that could be execute judgment on Jerusalem. There's some text, and we're learning this on Wednesday night in our hermeneutic study, that there's some text that when you get through exhausting all your evidence, it's still hard to decide which direction it's going. And this is one of them for me, and I'll leave that for you to decide. In application, it applies to the second coming because we're already past the destruction of Jerusalem. The judgment is coming from the Lord. Let's go now to examples. We're not going to exhaust that. We don't have time to exhaust that one fully. Let's go to verses 7 and verses 10 and 11. What three examples does he give of being patient, enduring? The first one is a farmer. What's his illustration of a farmer? He waits for fruit. He plants, and he doesn't go out the next day and suddenly he's got fruit. He doesn't do that. You don't plant corn and then the next day you reap your corn. He's going to have to wait. And he's going to have to wait for the rain and the early rain and the latter rain. And so he's got to endure and be patient and not expect everything to come real soon. So when is this oppression going to be over? It's going to be a little bit. When are they going to be dealt with? It may not be to the end of time. Or even if it's talking about the destruction of Jerusalem, it's going to be 5 years before the nation is destroyed. And I'm having to endure through all of this. So be patient like the farmer waiting for his fruits. Second illustration. Of the prophets. Now, how do the prophets help us? He doesn't give any specifics about that. He just says, the prophets. Yes, sir.
A prophet prophesizes. Otherwise, he tells of a future event that's going to come true. If he's a true prophet, then you know he's a true prophet whenever he tells something that's going to happen 5, 10, 50 years from now. When that date shows up and it transpires, then you know that he's a true prophet.
All right. That's true. What about the prophets of old? There's a couple of aspects of that. What about the prophets that prophesied of the Messiah and the days of the kingdom? Did they long to see those days?
Yes.
Peter said they did. Did they see those days? No, they didn't. They didn't live to see it. They died before it ever came to fruition. So they waited a long time for the fulfillment of their prophecy. They would have given their eye teeth to have seen those days. So they endured all of that. Well, there's another aspect of the prophets. Did the prophets prophesy to turn the nation around? Sure they did. Did they turn around? No. Take Jeremiah, for example. Did he prophesy concerning the 70 years? Yes. Did Daniel know about the 70 years? But he had to wait a long time for the fulfillment of that. Does that make sense? So the prophets are prime examples of endurance, patiently bearing through trials and tribulation. Third example that he gives. Job, the only time Job is mentioned by name in the New Testament. And the text says, remember the patience, King James says, New King James says, perseverance of Job. Now, we use the word patient to have reference to a person who's not addled and they're just very calm. Job was anything but calm, I want to tell you. Job was disturbed. He was upset. He was upset at God. He was upset at his friends. But the text says he was patient. What does that mean? He's long-suffering. He endured. He didn't give up. And he held true to his faith. Now, God rebuked him for some things. But at the same time, he never gave up on his faith. Does that make sense? Now, let's go further with Job. Look at the end of verse 11. You've heard of the patience of Job and have seen the end intended by the Lord. That is the aim or the purpose. English Standard New Century Version translated purpose or aim. That the Lord is very compassionate and merciful. Now, what does that have to do with all of this?
How Job was rewarded, or how Job got his stuff back in war.
All right. Do you see a contrast between the end of verse 11 and what verses 1 to 6 just said? What's going to happen to the oppressor? He's going to be judged. What happens to those who are patient? There's patience, and what's our wording here? The Lord is going to be compassionate and merciful. Does that make sense? So if you endure, the Lord's going to be compassionate and merciful to you. If you are the oppressor, God's going to judge you. Make sense? Big difference. Big difference. Questions or comments down through verse 11? All right, let's go to verse 12. Verse 12 says, don't swear. And I don't think this is oh, by the way, let me insert something here that we might just, out of context, insert. This has everything to do with the context. But above all, my brethren, do not swear, either by heaven or by earth or by any other oath. But let your yes be yes and your no, no, lest you fall into judgment. That will remind you of another text. Matthew 5, 33 through verse 37. Same concept. The Jews had a concept based on Matthew 5 that if you made an oath and said you're going to swear by something, if you swore by one thing, it was binding, but if you swore by something else, it was not binding. And so this deals with the idea of some kind of common oath. There's two things I want you to see here. Is this seem to be talking about a common oath. So what's this have to do with the context? Several have suggested that it fits the context because you're apt to make rash promises when you're threatened and when you're oppressed. When all things are calm, when the sea's calm, you're not apt to make some rash promise of what you will do or not do. But when you're threatened and the oppression is on, you may make some rash promise that you don't intend to fulfill. And so don't make oaths. I do not think this is, and I'm not going to get into the arguing of this case, but I'm not convinced that this deals with judicial oaths where you go to court and you affirm or promise to tell the truth, whole truth, and nothing but the truth as a witness in court or whatever. But he's talking about common oaths where I'm swearing I'm going to do this and I swear I'm going to do that. Those common oaths. You shouldn't have to do that. Why? Stay with verse 12. Your word should be good. Let your yes mean yes and your no mean no. In other words, be a person of your word. Now let's make some practical application of that. Let's start with the context first. So what he's saying in the context is don't make rash oaths in the midst of oppression. Don't make promises you won't fulfill. It'd be better to suffer and be killed than to make some promise you don't fulfill, wouldn't it? But now let's make some practical application of us. We're probably not being oppressed. So in what sense should our yes be yes and our no mean no?
In all cases, if you're a man of your word, as the old saying, if you're a man of your word, that means everything. Used to be in this country, you could make an agreement, me and Stephen could make an agreement, we just shake hands on it, and that was considered between us an uncommon law that deal was going to transpire.
Absolutely. Let me suggest something. I deal with a lot of construction people. I am now and I have for years. Do you know when a subcontractor tells you, I'll be there tomorrow, you know what that means? Nothing. Absolutely nothing. Do you know what it means when somebody says, I will call you back in an hour? You know what that means? Nothing. Absolutely nothing. That's true across all businesses. For the Christian, here's what I'm driving at. For the Christian, if you say, I will be at your house tomorrow, what does that mean? You made a commitment to me. You made a promise. Now, something can come up. I understand that. But if you say, I will call you tomorrow, you made a commitment. Let your yes be yes. Let your promise mean something. You shouldn't have to say, I tell you what, let me put my hand on the Bible. I swear I will be there tomorrow. You shouldn't have to do that. If you say you will, you will. Be a person of your word. Does that make sense? I'm going to tell you, it's not much better among Christians than it is among the world. Because I've dealt with a lot of Christians in the building industry, and it ain't much better. I'm going to tell you. It ain't much better. Word means nothing in the present day. Questions or comments on verse 12 before we go further? All right, let's talk about prayer, verses 13 to 18. In the midst of oppression, there needs to be prayer. We're not going to spend a lot of time on the real controversial section, and the reason for that is we spent time on that in our Wednesday night hermeneutic study. I want to hit that quickly, But here's three things that go on here. If you are sick or afflicted, pray. If you have sinned, you need to pray. And then he talks about how prayer does good. Now, I'm going to go kind of out of order here. I want to start at verses 16 to 18 and then go back to the other. Let's talk about the effectiveness of prayer. I'm not disagreeing with the inspiration's order, but I want to drive home the effectiveness of it and then go back. So let's start at verse 16. The effectual fervent, at the end of verse 16, the effective fervent prayer of a righteous man avails much. It does good. Now his illustration of that, he first of all says it does good. Now he gives an example. I'm going to prove my point by citing an example for you, James says. What's his example? Elijah. What did Elijah do? He prayed about the weather twice. One time he prayed that it wouldn't rain. What happened? Didn't rain. And then he prayed again that it would rain, and what happened? It rained. His point is prayer is effective. Prayer is effective. It's interesting to me the illustration that he chooses to show prayer is effective, isn't it? About Elijah praying, and it wouldn't rain, and prayed that it did, and so prayer is powerful. Now let's go back up to verses 13 to 15 now and talk about the sick and the afflicted. Is anyone among you suffering? Well, certainly they were suffering if there is oppression. Then let him pray. If he's cheerful, let him sing psalms. If you're not suffering, then praise God and sing. If you're suffering, then pray to God. Is anyone among you sick? That's a word there that means physical sickness. This is where our hermeneutics comes to play. I might want to look that word up and find out what that word means. And the word there just simply means or gives us the idea of being weak or feeble or sick, literally sick, physically sick. And so is anyone sick among you? Let him call for the elder of the church and let him pray over him, anointing him with oil in the name of the Lord. And we talked about that on Wednesday night, that I think is probably miraculous in the days of spiritual gifts. It could be a medicinal, but I take that as we examine that on Wednesday night. I can give you more evidence of that later, but I would cite Mark 6:13 perhaps as evidence of that. Most likely that has reference to the laying on of hands in the days of spiritual gifts. And the prayer of faith will save the sick. Now that's a different word there. Because here that word just simply means distressed or weary. So that's why I talk about praying if you're sick or if you're afflicted. If you are sick, physically sick, their prayer needs to be offered. The emphasis is on prayer more than the oil. And if you are afflicted, you need to be praying unto God. And even in the midst of sin, verse 15b and 16, confess your faults one toward another and pray one for another that you may be healed. So whatever the circumstance, you're in the midst of sin, pray. If you are sick, you pray. If you're afflicted, pray. Does that make sense in the context? Questions or comments on that before I want to come back to verse 16 a little bit later. I want to go ahead and finish the chapter, but come back maybe to verse 16 in a moment. All right, let's leave that because I want to get through the rest of the chapter. That's not what I want right now. That's our anointing with oil. Let's go to verse 19 and 20. Verse 19 and 20, his point here is keep one another in the truth. Keep one another in the truth. So here's some things I'm learning from this. It's possible to depart. Departing is a drifting away. Souls are at stake, and other Christians can play part in that. Let's get verse 19. If anyone among you wanders from the truth and someone turns him back. It's possible that during the midst of oppression, one gives up and wanders from the truth. What does that mean? What does the rest of the verse tell you as a Christian you need to be doing? Try to restore them. Let him know that the one who turns the sinner from the error of his way saves a soul from death and will cover a multitude of sin. What does it mean to cover sin? If I use that expression, brother so-and-so is covering his sin, you probably think I mean he's hiding, disguising it. That's biblical language, not for hiding the sin. It's hidden all right, but it's forgiveness. Psalm 32:1. Psalm 85:2 use that expression and uses the term forgiveness in comparison to, or not in contrast, but as synonymous is the word I was looking for, synonymous with covering a multitude of sins. You cover the sin by being forgiven. So if you got sin, you need to cover it. How do you cover it? By being forgiven of that. Does that make sense?
That's the same thing as blotting out.
Yeah, same concept, yeah. You blot it out, you cover it, it's gone, it's not seen. That is the idea. So, let's see this. We've got 2 or 3 minutes to go, and I want to cover a couple of other things. Does the chapter make sense? Here's some encouragement in the midst of oppression. Your oppressors are going to be dealt with. You patiently bear through all of this and endure. Don't make rash oaths. Pray in the midst of that. And then when you see somebody drifting from the truth, help each other out and keep one another in the truth. That's his point. That's what he's saying. Let's get a couple of practical lessons, and then I want to mention one thing about James 5, if perhaps we have time. Practical things from James 5. What do you take home with you?
Our dependence on God.
Say again.
Our dependency on God, even if you're rich, you have to keep in mind God kept you there.
All right, our dependency is upon God. What else? All right. The importance of endurance. What else? Let's get one more. Be people of the word. Say what you mean what you say, and you shouldn't have to swear in order to convince people you're telling the truth. Let's talk about James 5:16. Just as a footnote to James 5:16, this is footnote material. This is the only passage that I know of in the New Testament on public confession of sin of the Christian. You say, what about 1 John 1:9? There's nothing to indicate in 1 John 1:9 that is a public confession. That one might be made public, but that's a confession, an acknowledgement to God. Does that make sense? So when we start talking about making public confessions of sin, any conclusion that we draw has to be drawn from this text. We cannot demand more than this text demands or less than this text demands. Does that make sense? So whatever conclusion I draw has to harmonize with this text. All right? What I'm learning from this text, there is a time for a public confession. Confess your faults one toward another. We confess to other Christians what we've done. There's a time for that. What we're confessing is sin, not that we could just do better. How many times, I'm not trying to be critical of someone if you've done this, but more as an encouragement, let's try to fit the text. The text talks about acknowledging your sin, not that I could do better. If that's what confession involves, how many people need to come forward this morning? Every one of us. There's room for growth. I could do better. All right? The confession is to be as public as the sin. How do I draw that conclusion?
If someone commits something where other people see it, then when you confess to God, your brother still, you might have forgiveness from God, but your brother still sees you as a sinner, and a little leaven corrupts the whole lump. So
All right. Good point. The public sin of 1 Corinthians 5, you quoted 1 Corinthians 5:6, was corrected publicly according to 2 Corinthians 2, wasn't it? That was a public sin corrected publicly. There's nothing in this text that suggests to me that every private sin, I had a bad thought, I need to go confess that publicly. Let me deal with, how much time we got? Our time's about gone. We got about a minute. Let me deal with one other thing here. This idea of mutual confession. I don't have time to develop this fully. Some have used this passage, and I just want to warn you about a misconception people have. Some have misused this passage to force a mutual confession. Usually not done in an assembly, but watch for this sometimes when you're in a private setting, when people have maybe 20 people in their home, where one brother will start it out. This has happened, and this has been encouraged. But not by anybody presently with us now, but I've been in churches where this has been encouraged. Have about 20 people in your home, and some brother starts that and said, I want to acknowledge to y'all, I'm really, really struggling with, and he pours out his heart about all of his sin. Okay, that's fine. And I want you to pray for me. I want you to pray for me. Now then, he turns and said, what's your problem? Start spilling your beans. And what's your problem? And what's your problem? What's your problem? And it's kind of a forced confession. And that's happened in a number of places. And because that's what James is talking about, they think. James is not talking about that. James is not talking about a mutual confession. In James chapter 5, there's a difference between voluntary and forced. I don't have time to develop all of these, but interesting, number 5, David confessed his sin, Simon confessed his. There's no evidence that they encouraged, turned around and turned to others and said, now you confess yours. If I've got sin, I need to acknowledge it. Stephen's got sin, he needs to acknowledge it, but there's no biblical evidence that I turn around and say, okay, I've confessed mine, now you spill your guts. If you don't, then I'll look more holy than you because I'm humble enough to say, here's what I've done, but you won't do that. That's done in a number of places, has been done over and over again. We don't have time to develop that fully. James 5 does not invite us to go looking for sin. This is a case where sin has found us. Does that make sense? So watch for the person who does that and who is ready to jump on that. We need to confess our faults one toward another. And here it is. And so I'm going to start. I'm going to tell you what all I've done. It's a case of I'm broken and I know you are too. And that doesn't fit the pattern of the New Testament.